Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for that welcome. I suspect the people that applaud before they hear someone speak have great faith or great charity. Let me give you an incident from the first year of Pope Francis's service to illustrate why I'm so happy to be here this evening. I was the Archbishop of Indianapolis, and there's a rather famous university who plays in the Big East called Butler. And Butler had just opened a Center for Reconciliation that bore the name of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town, South Africa. The Archbishop came for the dedication, and I had the privilege of having lunch with him. And it was probably about 4 or 5 months after Francis's election. And at one point in the meal, apropos to nothing so far, he leaned over and he said, "Oh my, you Catholics did rather well in that election." And I said, "Well, yes, I'm quite happy." And he says, "My God, man, I'd be jumping up and down." Well, I'll spare you a seismic event and just simply say that I'm grateful to Villanova University for this opportunity to think a little bit about an aspect of Pope Francis. And my great consolation is to know that there'll be time for questions afterwards. You can correct me if you need to. But even more importantly, there are much better speakers coming up. So if you follow baseball, this is going to be like batting after the pitcher. Okay. When Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio addressed the College of Cardinals on the eve of the conclave of 2013, he did not hide his anxiety for the church, nor did he sugarcoat the problems that the church was facing. However, he did not see the answer as turning inward in self-examination, or worse, self-preservation. Shortly after the conclave, the Archbishop Emeritus of Havana, Cuba, Cardinal Jaime Ortega, was quoted in a Cuban Catholic magazine saying that hours before his election, the future Pope turned to his fellow cardinals, saying that the Church must turn away from self-absorption in what he termed a theological narcissism. Cardinal Bergoglio proposed instead an embrace of others and invited the Church to focus its energies on the peripheries, which we have come to understand as not only a geographic reference, although it's interesting, Google Pope Francis countries visited, and you might see that there is a geographical periphery in the Church. But it's also an allusion to those who feel or have been treated as peripheral: the poor, the damaged, the unbelieving, among others. In this modest contribution, I hope to prepare the way for the speakers who will follow by demonstrating Pope Francis's engagement with the world, especially in its messiness, that this method of engagement is rooted in the Second Vatican Council and also exemplified in the pontificate of his immediate predecessors, especially Pope St. John Paul II. In the 5 years since his election, Pope Francis has consistently invited the Church to look outward. At the same time, and I think you're all aware of this, there have been insistent calls that have intensified for Christians to accept that this nation, and really most of the world, is hostile to the gospel, as the trappings of a cultural veneer that formerly supported Christianity have fallen away. True disciples will be fewer in number and must withdraw from the world in order to witness effectively to the world. I would invite you to set aside just for a moment the exhilarating vision of Pope Francis and ask honestly, do we need a smaller, purer church? In the last decades, Catholics have joined other Christians in describing the Church in the United States as suffering because of large numbers of members who are indifferent, unengaged, dissenting, or even hostile to orthodoxy and orthopraxis. These critics seem to suggest that we need to whittle down our numbers from the current 70 million or so to perhaps 20 million. I suspect, however, that even that will be excessive and will inevitably include some slackers. So we might have to narrow our vision to an assembly of 2 million believers. However, even that risks tepidity, so we ought to reduce our prognosis to 2,000. And honestly, just inevitably, you and me. And I have some doubts about you. This call for a smaller, purer church could well be an expression of the individualism that permeates our culture. In the history of the church, even from ancient times, there have been individuals and movements who have tried to define and delimit what it means to be a Catholic Christian. Nevertheless, the universal church has always repudiated such attempts. It is only the Lord who ultimately judges who belongs and who does not belong. He does so with the patience of the farmer in the parable who allows the wheat and the weeds to grow together until the harvest. The other side of this individualism is the proposal that true Christians band together in small enclaves and establish ourselves almost like fortresses that will safeguard the treasure of Christian tradition in its purest form from the corrosive intrusion of a corrupt society. Ever since St. Paul's speech in the Areopagus, when he cited the poets of ancient Greece to persuade the Athenians of his message concerning the true God, Christians have engaged with the larger world, not always consistently, not always critically, and sometimes opposed by higher authorities, and sometimes by sheer force of circumstances. This engagement has produced often surprising benefits to the church. For example, during World War II, especially in Europe, Roman Catholic priests, religious, and Protestant ministers were frequently imprisoned in the same barracks. They could not help but talk with one another and learn more about their respective traditions. These conversations fostered a positive ecumenical climate after the war and contributed to greater openness on the part of the Catholic Church to the ecumenical movement. I know that from conversations with one of my confreres who's gone home to God, Bernard Herring. Herring, a great moralist and who restored moral theology to its scriptural roots, also was a great ecumenist. And his ecumenical outlook was forged in the terrible conditions of the Second World War. Listening to Orthodox, listening to Jewish communities, knowing the great suffering. Now, this ecumenical legacy, if you will, to the Second World War was only one element in an incredible constellation of factors that led to the Second Vatican Council. A constellation so varied and yet so single in its outcome of the calling of the Council that we must increasingly recognize it as the work of God. The Council forces us to reject any search for a purer, smaller church based on individualistic criteria or for building a citadel to keep the world out. At the very beginning of the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, the bishops define the Church as sign and instrument of communion with God and of the unity of the whole human race. The Church has a responsibility and a mission to the entire human race. The church has much in common already with all baptized Christians, but also, and I quote Lumen Gentium 16, those who have not yet accepted the Gospels are related to the people of God in various ways. The church ignores no one. At the same time, the church is composed of sinful members. Hence, the council frequently calls for a renewal of hearts and structures. In this sense, a purer church, yes. A smaller church, no. The way of the church is not condensation, but of humility that befits a pilgrim people. Various documents of the Council provide a foundation and guidelines for the Church's relationship with other Christians and religions. But the Church's relationship with the larger world is dramatically affirmed in the decree Ad Gentes on the Church's missionary activity. And I quote, "The Church on earth is by its very nature missionary, since according to the plan of the Father, it has its origin in the mission of the Son and the Holy Spirit. The church has no other option but to turn outward. Otherwise, it is no longer the church." This turning outward extends to the human condition in its heights and depths. Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, begins with these stirring words: "The joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the people of our times, especially of those who are poor or afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ as well." This is the church emerging from a self-imposed ghetto, coming out of the fortress and entering, yes, the messiness of our world, driven by a divinely inspired solidarity with all of humanity, and filled in its depths with empathy for the travails of every human being. Gaudium et Spes recognizes the achievements of the modern world, but also its ambiguities. It seeks to contribute to the entire range of human effort and to the resolution of the many challenges humanity faces. Underlying this is the Church's belief that through each of its members and its community as a whole, it can help make the human family and its history more human. At the same time, the Church profits from the experience of past ages, from the progress of the sciences, and from the riches in various cultures, through which greater light is thrown on the human nature and new avenues to truth are opened up. Very few would doubt that the Vatican Council's mandate for the Church's engagement with the world constitutes one of many paradigm shifts that have marked the history of the Church. As with all paradigm shifts, especially after some ecumenical councils, it provoked controversy. In 1971, Blessed Pope Paul VI convoked a synod of bishops on the issues of justice in the world and the ministerial priesthood. The bishops produced 2 documents on these issues, which were approved by the Holy Father. In the document on justice, you may recall the bishops wrote, "Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel," or in other words, of the Church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. The bishops are affirming that there can be no true evangelization without action for justice. A case can be made for saying that this statement is teaching of the ordinary magisterium, since it was made by a synod of bishops with the approval of the pontiff. Even if it was neglected by subsequent documents from the Holy See, I do not believe that its validity can be questioned. Pope St. John Paul II continued the Church's engagement with the world. Not a surprise, since he was a major contributor to Gaudium et Spes. The principle of solidarity was significant in his teaching. At his homily in Yankee Stadium on October 2nd, 1979, during his first visit to the United States, commenting on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, John Paul exclaimed passionately, "We cannot stand idly by if in any place the Lazarus of the 20th century stands at our door." In his apostolic exhortation, Reconciliation and Penance of 1984, Pope John Paul II states that the social sins are the result of many personal sins, among which are the sins of, and I quote, "those who are in a position to avoid, eliminate, or at least limit certain social evils, but who fail to do so out of laziness, fear, or the conspiracy of silence through secret complicity or indifference." Silence in the face of social evil should be a subject for the examination of conscience, not only by individual members of the Church, but also by collegial bodies. Friends, I've been trying to show that Pope Francis's engagement with the world, especially in its messiness, is rooted in Vatican II and exemplified by the pontificate of Pope St. John Paul II. I want to point out two other features of his papacy that also resonate in the ministry of Pope Francis. First, in his many visits to almost every region of the world, John Paul II made the Church visible by the crowds he drew, as well as the various liturgical and non-liturgical celebrations over which he presided. The Catholicity of the Church emerged in a dramatic collage of developed and developing nations, with an immense variety of languages and cultures representing so many diverse races and ethnicities, all of whom could recognize something of themselves in familiar elements such as song, dance, and clothing, incorporated into the celebrations. Pope Francis has continued the tradition of travel, but places a greater emphasis on visiting the margins. Once again, Google and see where he's gone. He has made the Church visible among those who are most abandoned, most forgotten, most in need. The second point of convergence is Pope St. John Paul's removal from the 1983 Code of Canon Law the possibility in the 1917 Code that divorced and civilly remarried Catholics could be excommunicated. Earlier in his apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio of 1981, he urged pastors and whole communities of the faithful to help the divorced, to make sure that they do not consider themselves as separated from the Church. For as baptized persons, they can and indeed must share in her life. According to John Paul, they should be encouraged to, quote, attend the sacrifice of the Mass, to contribute to the works of charity and to community efforts in favor of justice, to bring up their children in the Christian faith, to cultivate the spirit and practice of penance. He says that the Church must, quote, show herself a merciful mother and thus sustain them in the faith and hope. And we could ask ourselves, has Pope Francis gone very far from these words in Amoris Laetitia? I don't want to enter into that controversy here, unless you want to, except to say that both popes are united in their care for the wounded members of our Church. In convoking an ecumenical council, Pope St. John XXIII, who, by the way, would have known very well what a field hospital was, hoped that the council would lead to a more positive proclamation of Catholic teaching in the context of a very troubled world. This, too, was a form of engagement with the world. Such engagement is very evident in the teaching of Pope Benedict XVI. Particularly relevant was his emphasis on keeping faith and reason in reciprocal relationships. Faith without reason can lead to extremism, and reason without faith can lead to an oppressive relativism. In his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, he issued a powerful plea not only to the Church, but also to a skeptical world to recognize the beauty and immensity of God's unconditional love for each human being. And what strikes me as a dramatic passage of that encyclical, Benedict writes, God's love for his people is so great that it turns God against himself, his love against his justice. No great leap is required to move from this to Pope Francis's constant proclamation of God's untiring mercy. Some proponents of a smaller, purer church have tried to enlist Joseph Ratzinger as an ally. But a study of Ratzinger's theology by Professor Christopher Ruddy, professor of ecclesiology at the Catholic University of America, has shown that while Ratzinger, with other theologians, recognizes that the church may become numerically smaller, quote, the few are the starting point from which God seeks to save the many. Ratzinger's conception of the church envisions a humble, diaconal, and other-centered community. I want to propose that Pope Francis's engagement with the world and his provoking the church to do the same is the most recent phase of a trajectory that can be initially traced back to Vatican II. A further illustration of this is his encyclical Laudato Si. Ecological concerns have been on the Holy See's agenda for a number of years. By dedicating an encyclical to these concerns, Pope Francis not only elevated them to a priority in the Church's mission to the world, but has also established common ground with the many individuals and organizations who share these concerns. The Church in recent decades has been somewhat marginalized by many for what they see as a preoccupation with sexual ethics. The Church cannot reverse itself on some of its positions in sexual ethics, but Pope Francis has shown that there are other issues on which the Church and world can work together. This too is a step in the trajectory that leads back to Vatican II. I maintain, however, that this trajectory must be traced even further back, to Moses and the burning bush. As we read just a few weeks ago, God has witnessed the affliction of God's people. I know well what they are suffering. And so God commands Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. When Moses asks for his name, he replies, I am who am. This is the fundamental revelation of God's mystery that has guided Jewish and Christian faith and prayer over the centuries. But note that this revelation is intrinsically bound to his will for the liberation of people. God cannot be understood apart from his will for the integral salvation of the human beings. But note also that Moses is to tell the king of Egypt that he must let people go so that in the wilderness they can offer a sacrifice to the Lord our God. God's revelation of his name leads to authentic worship. The true God, true worship, true care for the afflicted, these are so interrelated that they cannot be separated. To offer true worship to the true God means commitment to true care for others. Liturgy is not a shelter, but a launch into the messiness of the human condition. True care for the afflicted is not just social work or action for justice, but zealous restoration of broken hearts and broken bodies to the fullness of human dignity and participation in communities of friendship and faith. The first sign of the presence of the Messiah is the healing of broken hearts, and then the opening of eyes and ears. Another phase in the trajectory of the church of mercy and compassion is Jesus himself. When he is asked by the disciples of John the Baptist as to whether or not he is the Messiah, he responds, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The dead are raised. The poor have the good news proclaimed to them." Jesus identifies himself through the care he gives to others. His followers through the centuries have pursued the same trajectory. Benedictine monasteries provide shelter, healing, and education to the larger world. The mendicant orders of the 13th century walk in the midst of the marginalized. And in the later years, as one historian has written, the great inventive achievement in the connection with the Christian religion at the close of the 16th and during the first half of the 17th centuries consisted in combining the ardor of religious sentiment and the determination to bring the practice of Christian morality into the temporal world with the spread of new tenderness and a new gentleness in human relations. This was due to the influence of such saints as Francis de Sales, Vincent de Paul, Jane de Chantal. Another important phase in the trajectory emerging from the burning bush was the Church's declaration of its preferential option for the poor in the second half of the 20th century. But this is not a one-sided option in the sense that the poor become simply the passive beneficiaries of our benevolence. This option makes space not only for the active involvement of the poor in the correction of social injustice and the creation of just structures, but also for their voices to be heard by the world and the church. For the poor bear witness to faith, courage, perseverance, hospitality, solidarity, creativity in the midst of great vulnerability and often dehumanizing conditions. It is not easy for us in a world of comfort and convenience to allow the poor to enter our lives because they remind us of the vulnerability that ultimately every human being must confront. And that is perhaps why it is difficult, even for Christians, to accept Christ crucified. It's much easier to accept Christ the Good Shepherd, the gentle healer, the teacher. But Christ crucified is the poorest of the children of the human race, confronting us with a stark reality that all of us must be despoiled of everything in order to gain abundant life. Pope Francis has allowed the voice of the poor to be heard in today's world. He has gone out to the margins, even before his election, and brought back to the center of the church their cry for justice and their yearning for fullness of life. He has also allowed their faith and love to be seen by the community of the church and world. He appeals to the conscience of all to engage in profound self-examination and discernment as to the direction we want to take as individuals and communities in responding to the cry of the poor, to the structures of sin that envelop us, to the ideologies that warp our thinking, and to all the conflicts that divide us. I'm not sure whether the Pope likes to offer toasts. You don't do that during synods. But I suspect that he would make his own Cardinal Newman's famous toast. I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. It was, after all, Newman's conscience that prodded him in a long and unrelenting search for truth that led him to recognize the Roman Catholic Church as the church that, in its fundamental structures, including the papacy, came from Christ. And today, Pope Francis prods our consciences to foster within our hearts and communities the spirit of mercy, empathy, compassion, and commitment to go out to the margins. As he reminds us often, however, to go to the margins can be messy. Field hospitals are messy. The journey to the margins will prove too daunting for many, and they will prefer to remain within comfortable borders. God's mercy embraces them. The church might indeed become smaller, but there will also be adventurers, as there have been since the very beginning, who perhaps timidly at first, but then boldly, driven by the gospel and their conscience, will go to the margins, maybe close by, maybe far away, and engage themselves in the struggle for justice, for equality, for the recognition of the infinite dignity of every human being, and for peace. And what do you think? The church indeed might become purer. For your attention, thank you very much. Directions. I'm not sure. I don't think it's on. Let's see if we can get there.
It's on the bottom.
Mr. Duffy's going to take us out of the...
He gave you a tutorial and everything.
Those of you who have written down questions on the index cards, have you done that, or maybe we could collect them?
I think they need a minute to wait. They were so rapid.
Yes, or so.
You know, people sometimes say, wow, there's great turnout. I recall as the Archbishop of Indianapolis, I would participate in the largest single-day sporting event in the world. It wasn't the Final Four. It's the Indianapolis 500. You know that, Father Marty? And I'd stand on that track and I'd look up at the stands and there'd be 3, 4, 500,000 people. And I'd think, I wonder how many of them are coming hoping to see a car wreck. You know?
I don't know if this is a question, it's more of a statement.
Okay.
An excellent, powerful, and profoundly thought-provoking talk. A true examination of conscience. I only wish it could have been televised on EWTN.
I hope the writer's not holding her breath. Do you think that those involved in arms manufacturing believe in the dignity of the human person? There's two questions here. I would have to say I don't know. But I do remember a study, maybe you saw it, I guess it's now well over 20 years ago, 30 years ago. A journalist from the New York Times lived in Amarillo, Texas for about a year to study the Pantex plant. And the Pantex plant was the single plant where nuclear arms were assembled in the United States. And he interviewed people and said, you know, what? And a lot of the people, evangelical Christians, thought they were actually hastening the return of Jesus because they believed that Jesus was going to return in a nuclear conflagration, the big word, that means big explosion, conflagration, thank you. So I suppose there are some people who think that. I suspect a lot of people don't think at all, you know, and I know as a member of a religious order that's tried to engage in ethical investments, it's difficult sometimes to follow the trail and figure out, where your investments are going, but it's worth the struggle. So I really don't know why people do, but there are narratives that would give this, if not a eschatological value, it would give it a patriotic value. How might the church stop supporting involvement in war? Well, I think one way is to offer alternatives to violence. And I'm not simply violence in guns going off or bombs. I'd like to think about violence in words. This has really impressed me, how especially the internet, which was supposed to be this great forum for ideas, actually turns into kind of a free-for-all, but with awful words. And awful words are used by people in political discourse, often with the internet, to wreak great harm. And I think we have to name that, the violence that's among us. The violence that sometimes even in those who pursue arguably good and evangelical values espouse. At dinner tonight we were talking, and I mentioned a trip that I made in 1993, I think, when I first began working in Rome. I was sent by my superior to Chile. And I arrived just after the leadership of our order was elected for that country. And the fellow who was the provincial superior was elected on the 35th ballot. He didn't receive any votes on the first 34. So you don't have to be a Villanova graduate to figure out this is one divided group. And I remember walking with that sacrificial lamb a couple of days later, and I said, "Oh, Raul, what happened? What was going on in the chapter?" And he said to me, "Jose, you got to remember that we lived under a military dictatorship, and we hated it, and we preached against it. We demonstrated. Some of us went to jail. We laid our lives on the line to make the military fall. But without us being aware of it, their attitude penetrated us. And we treat each other like juntas. So that when one junta takes power, they exile all the enemies of the state." That was a seminal experience for me. And later on, I saw a similar attitude in Eastern Europe, where people detested the Communist Party, but they learned a lot from the Communist Party. And a lot of the relationships were still conditioned by things that they learned from them. So I ask myself, this sort of polarizing paralysis that has stymied our government, have we carried that into the church? Do we treat each other as enemies? Do we ask each other subtle little questions like, what websites do you visit? What do you read? And then we decide whether or not we'll talk with each other. I think we have to model an alternative to that. And that, that will be a prophetic action in this country if we're able to image a community that talks and... Thank you. Well, that looks way too long. Okay, I'll move on. I won't go on. Comment on the relationship between pastoral and doctrinal theology. Is it different under Francis? Well, that would probably be like asking me to do an appendectomy right now. I'm not sure I'm qualified. But I do lean on an observation that the founder of my religious family made once, St. Alphonsus Liguori. He said a problem in the church is when the confessors don't study and the professors don't hear confessions. So I think the notion of praxis in theology, which is not, dogmatic theology light, It's actually where the rubber hits the road for the salvation of souls. I think that that is getting a greater attention because of Pope Francis's the particular language that he uses. And I see his language as not simply the words that he speaks, but the gestures and decisions that he makes. And I think other people see that too. I also mentioned at supper that in June of 2013, I was in Rome to receive the pallium for Indianapolis. And I took my sisters and a couple of friends to a trattoria, an Italian restaurant that was far enough off the clerical beat that you didn't have to wear this stuff. But the waiters knew what I did for a living, And the three of them came over to the table and they were so excited by this new pope. And I just read that morning a rather nasty, snide column in an Italian newspaper. So I thought I would test the critique that I had read that morning. I said, well, that's all fine and good. I mean, I'm glad business is up and there are more visitors coming to the Wednesday audience. But let's be honest. He really isn't a theologian. And they looked at me. He said, and he talks off the cuff a lot. And they looked again, like, who is this guy? And I said, he repeats himself. And finally, one of them said, he's speaking a language that we can understand. I said, bravo. I said, that's what he's doing. And it's not that Pope Benedict or John Paul II didn't do that. But I think he does it in a unique way. And what is one of my great experiences is the way he is reaching beyond the boundaries of the church. In our Episcopal conference, my first meetings in 2000, after returning to the United States, I thought, I wonder if anybody heard that there's a new pope, because he wasn't mentioned, except for the bishops on the Ecumenical Commission, because all their dialogue partners were tremendously excited. And I think the situation has changed in the conference now, but I think it's because his language is a very good bridge between the false divide between pastoral and doctrinal theology. Okay, let me just, got a couple more here. How's our time, Barbara? Are we okay?
I think we're okay. If you're okay, maybe 2 hours.
Somebody give me a blank. I probably, I'll take that as fraternal correction. Okay. Do you anticipate Pope Francis will call for a new ecumenical council? Would it help us all grow closer to each other in God? I don't think so. I mean, not that the council can help us grow. I don't think he's going to call a new one. Why? Because we're still learning what the Second Vatican Council means. And earlier today I got to meet one of the great heroes of my life, Father John O'Malley, and if you haven't read his book on what happened to Vatican II, read it, because he'll point out too that the reception of a council takes some time, and it's in that process of assimilating the council that we can really mine its work, and he's demonstrated it with other councils like the Council of Trent, and I haven't read his newest work on Vatican I, but yeah, I don't think he's going to do that, but I think there are elements, plenty of them, in the Second Vatican Council that will help us grow closer to God and to each other. An example of the church being whittled down to a smaller, purer church is the recent firings of Catholic school teachers or other church employees who engage in a homosexual lifestyle. Then shouldn't they also fire employees who use birth control, etc.? I challenge the bishops to speak out against such firings. Well, no challenge is heard by one bishop. Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question. And I agree that if you're going to make that an actionable offense, well, there's a lot of other moral things, racism, for example, not just birth control, but if somebody makes a racist remark or, a racist teaching, engages in racist activity. But it's difficult. I think the church is moving on the question of same-sex couples. It's not moving as fast as many. I've gotten some very angry letters from a kid in one of our high schools that wants to bring his boyfriend to the prom. It's tough, you know, but I think there's been movement, and I think that I'm not sure that firing people is what I say to same-sex people that are in same-sex couples relationships, and they want to teach. I say, how do you do it? Just help me understand. You know, how do you communicate the fullness of the Catholic position, the Catholic moral reflection, and justify it, or I don't know, conjugate it with the choices you made with your life? Just help me understand that. Sometimes people do, you know, can give you some real insight. I think we got to have those conversations. Okay, but I agree. You know, I think this is a challenging. How do we persuade the faithful that Francis is not a heretic? Yeah. How do we persuade the faithful that Francis is not a heretic? I really didn't want everybody to hear that. That is, well, first, I mean, people throw the word heresy around like, you know, it was a rash or something, you know, that you could bring. I mean, the church has a very narrow definition of what heresy is. And personally, this is the Mother Tobin's oldest boy's definition of heresy. Heresy, in my mind, is an unwillingness to live with complexity. You want to boil it all down. God and human? No, it's got to be one or the other. Word and sacrament? No, it's got to be one or the other. And so I think that, I think a moment like this, hopefully we'll all become, you know, feel a certain impulse to, not to get violent like I sometimes tend to do with people that want to throw heresy around. Just say, look, you know, I think we got to measure our words because it's offensive to the gospel. It's offensive to Jesus Christ. And it's offensive to the Holy Father. And the Holy Father has an important role, whoever the Holy Father is, to play in the church. Pull that one out, and we can reap a whirlwind that we wouldn't expect. Okay, I think they're... Okay.
We're so appreciative of your willingness to respond to the questions, but also the context you gave us for looking at not just Pope Francis, but the church today and the mission of the church. And I think so many of us here are really very grateful that Pope has taken time to come here and to share with us and give us a whole perspective that is following his Father John O'Malley, who's going to be speaking soon. So I think all of us are just very grateful for your honesty, your openness, and your willingness to walk with us as church. We're all church. So let's thank Cardinal Tobin and...
This is a wonderful program.